Welcome to the Inspiration North podcast, inspiring stories from inspirational people and how they found their passion, their true north. I'm James Eves.
And I'm Michelle Minikin, and this is the Inspiration North podcast.
Today's episode, Go Beyond Your Own Limitations with Graham Sleep. We talk about how not to do leadership, you have to change the people or change the people, and we need to be more confident about what we have in the Northeast.
In spite of having battled a debilitating illness for over 25 years, Graham has developed people and their businesses for over 30 years. This included growth from 30 million to 300 million of a corporate division in the US, and then as general manager of an SME, taking it from 0 to 750k EBITDA in 3 years. He then built his own businesses, Improvement Architecture, and more recently IA Growth in the Northeast, where he and his partners now have a stable of fast-growing SMEs, where he is a non-executive director, strategic advisor or mentor to boards and senior leaders in the Northeast, Glasgow and London. He's a certified corporate executive coach and a team coach for Marshall Goldsmith, often voted #1 global coaching brand. And in the last 3 years, he has used his knowledge to develop leaders of charities and social enterprises through his 2020 vision, which to date has impacted over 2,500 children in the Northeast.
So Graham, I noticed that you are an engineer by trade. Is that something you wanted to be as a little boy?
It's an interesting one because actually I was always quite good at maths, at school, and that was probably my subject. So I always knew I would end up something analytical, whatever that may be. But actually I started looking as an accountant, as an architect. But at about 12, 13 years old, I got one of the old sort of electronic sets. And I used to do experiments with the electronic set, and that ventured into me then taking apart the radios and the TVs in the house. So it was fine as long as I could put them back together again. But there was once or twice when obviously my family weren't overly happy with us. And really, I suppose from that problem solving background, it was always going to be something I want to get into. I also went through a bit of a life experience at 14 when an uncle of mine passed away. He was actually in the Navy and was killed. And then the Navy became important to us. So at 17, I went to the Royal Navy as an artificer apprentice. So again, electronic engineering. And that's what I'd planned to do until 6 weeks later I left.
Oh,
And
wow.
I completely failed, and I got through my basic training, but then that was it. I was just too immature probably for, I think the next guy to me was about 21-year-old, and as a 17-year-old with 21-year-old pluses in your group, it wasn't the easiest time. So I suppose I got one of my biggest motivations from that as well, though, because, from failure comes. And actually, as I left, the officer had turned around and went, "Sleep, you will never make anything of yourself."
Oh, lovely.
So I decided to prove him wrong.
Yeah.
We hope you're listening.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think from there, it was very much about, following being in the Navy. I then came back basically because I'd already been going the Navy and I'd gotten the best results of anybody who went for the TIFF exam that year. It meant that really I didn't do my best in my O-levels at the time. So I left there with only 3, which funnily enough was maths, English and electronics. So therefore when I came back, the obvious thing to do was to go to college, and I ended up on one of this government schemes at the time, and ended up going through doing and eventually become an electronics engineer. So that was me up till I was about 22, 23-year-old. Worked for a very small company originally, and then moved from there to a global organisation which sort of changed my view a bit. That's set up in the Northeast called TRW. And I spent about 7 years there. And that was probably what made us originally. And then I went to another really good company, which was Burgess, which we'll probably talk about a bit more because I end up in the States and all sorts with that.
Mm-hmm. So were you progressing in the organisation?
Yeah, when I was with TRW, I ended up basically in charge of. They'd set up a new department actually for supply chain. So I ended up as a senior supply chain engineer with, I think, about 5 or 6 people reporting into us. So that was my first experience of leadership. Mm-hmm. And there's a really interesting story because this is the way not to do it. Mm-hmm. And I got told by a manager at the time in one of my performance reviews that I needed to take my passion out of things. It's very much about, for him, it was, the analytical decision making. Mm-hmm. You have to take your passion out of all that. So I tried to be this robot for 2 years and failed massively on being a leader in the organisation for 2 years. Didn't help with any of the relationships with people. And I learned pretty quickly that actually that wasn't me as well, because I'd never been so unhappy as I was in that role. So I sort of turned around one day and just said, well, I think I'm going to do it my way now. This doesn't really work. And if you don't like it, well,
exactly.
Sorry. Sorry, but I can't stay doing it this way. So I did start doing that, and we were pretty successful, did some fairly big projects for there. Mm-hmm. But then an old manager of mine had moved on to Burgess. Sire Group had just taken over Burgess Microswitch in the northeast, and he went to work for them, and for about a year and a half he chased us, and he got us drunk one night over a game of 10-pin bowling and said, okay, it must be time you're going to join us now, and I somehow said yes. So it ended up where I went to Sire Burgess. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. At that time it was very much about transformation of the organisation. It had been very much a loss stroke break even type of site. Mm-hmm. And with Sire getting involved, they wanted to turn it around, obviously. Mm-hmm. There were certain technologies that organisation had which were seen as critical within the organisation, around their abilities within sensors and other things. And I ended up being tasked with helping the company to what was called QS 9000, which was the first automotive quality standard at the time. Mm-hmm. So I moved out of supply development into this sort of more quality focused role, but I had a bit more of group exposure. I got put on their Managers of the Future program and all of this, of which there was only about 15 of us from all the sites around the world. Mm-hmm. So that was quite a nice thing to get. 18 months time we got accredited at QS 9000. We won the first plants in the UK anywhere to be accredited, so we got a little bit of profile out of that. Mm-hmm. And that meant I started getting lots of phone calls offering us a lot more money to go and do it elsewhere. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And Sire decided that they wanted to keep us in the group and came to us and offered us a few different options within the group, of which I ended up out in Chicago. So that was a bit of a life changer.
I can imagine.
Yeah.
Was that, if you had a few options, why did Chicago attract you?
I think one of the reasons was that the guy who was groomed to be the next CEO was the divisional director for there, so that helped. Mm-hmm. But also as well, it was an organisation. I just looked at the time of, I suppose the American dream, the land of opportunity, etc. And from my side looking at it, it was, I can go there, they speak the same language. Mm-hmm. Okay, they drive on a different side of the road. They do drive on the different side of the road. But it was just somewhere where I thought, as a family as well, because by then I've got 2 sons, mm-hmm. that we could, come together and settle a bit more quickly. Mm-hmm. Because I knew going into the site, which had basically made a loss for the last 7 years or something, mm-hmm. That it was going to take a bit of a turnaround. Yeah. So I ended up, I went out originally, and then my wife and that followed for a short period, mm-hmm. but they didn't settle, so they came back. Okay. So then I was there on my own, And, I eventually came back sort of 3 years later, and we'd managed to turn the business around. And then we made a nice acquisition of a company for $58 million, which was quite a substantial amount for a kid like me to get involved with. Mm-hmm. And then we grew on the back of that in terms of the automotive industry again. So something I knew. And from that meant that we were able to develop the organisation to where they became about 300 million over that sort of 3-4 years. So that was a real learning situation from what was originally, when I went in, doing around about 50 million, and then went about 300 million.
What sort of were the typical challenges that were going on? Was it to do with people? Was it processes?
Yeah.
Was it?
Yeah, it's a standard challenges, process and people. So over there, the first thing I had to do was get some degree of... I felt the business was being hamstrung when I went in. It was hamstrung from two ways. One was the people, but also the other way was that quality systems had been put in place in the business, which actually hamstrung the business. That they were more concerned about doing it to the theory than actually progressing as a business. And it was something I saw fairly early on. So we tweaked certain things on that. I can't say we tweaked the people, because I got rid of quite a number of people in the initial stages. American law allows you to do that pretty much. Yeah. So I was able to do that and recruit better people but less people as well. But they had to speak almost the language I spoke, coming from an automotive background and the lean side. And so I wanted people who could speak around that and understood the 3-letter acronyms and everything else that you get around that. So it was good and we brought a few people on there, and that helped move things forward. I was aligned with another guy over there who's a young guy at the time, who I'd met through the global leaders thing we were doing. And he was more from a commercial side, I was more from an operations and supply chain side, and put the two of us together, then we did pretty well. So that was the way it worked.
So what are your biggest lessons for working in a different country?
The first thing is, it's not about strategy, it's about people. So whether you're building a business or whether you're moving to a different environment, it's about people. And having the two things come together, the first thing I did was make sure I created some friends. And it's difficult. America's difficult because most of them have come through uni or college together, and then they sort of keep on, and they have their close group of friends generally. So it is a little difficult to transition to there, even though, as I thought, it would be one of the easier options. So that was difficult. Where when you turn a business around, it's work hard, play hard. One of the first things I had to get was that people understood that there was a real focus and a real impetus now to change things. That helped to bring us together as a bit of a team as well. And let's be honest, all my early friends from out there all came from within the business. Which was a difficult one for us to balance, because I'm there to lead change, yet at the same time I'm trying to make friends with people, which doesn't always work very well.
No, it's a funny one, isn't it? It's that kind of, how much of a professional distance should you maintain? Yeah,
them professional boundaries. But I think there was a respect that I managed to gain from what we were achieving, from probably how I went about it early doors, in that, apart from probably one or two managers who I probably knew would go from landing there, everybody else was given an opportunity. And, there was new things that I brought in pretty early. So, I brought in things like bilingual supervisors. So everybody could understand and communication and messages. They'd never had that, which seems quite obvious, especially when you've got a workforce which is mainly, split between probably American and Hispanic, with one or two Asian influences in there. But, when you've got a workforce like that, then the first thing you need to do is communicate, surely. So that was something I did early, and I think that worked for us, because also the people who got put into them positions probably had started off as operators in the business, so they were being moved up. I was almost helping to develop them at the same time as getting them to make sure that the messaging that I was pushing down was basically got into the right places in the right language.
Okay, and so what looking back, what could you have done different or better? Because no one's ever that perfect.
No, and I probably did judge some other people too prematurely. there was a saying I heard over here before I went, which was you either change the people or you change the people.
Yes.
Right? And then I went out there and you sort of hear hire slow, fire quick.
Mm-hmm.
So with them thoughts in your mind, you almost sort of push down the route of making some. Plus, I also felt pressure in terms of, this needed changing around, and I probably had 12 months.
Yeah.
I'm trying to get to know people, but you've got 12 months to change things around.
Mm-hmm.
And, I probably did get rid of some good people, without a doubt. I got rid of maybe too much of the experience early, of product experience, which could have been helpful later. I think I was fortunate because I think I brought more in terms of the alignment of things. So like I remember my first effort, actually. This is quite funny, and this was pretty rubbish really when I look back now. But it was this, right, I'm going to create a vision. Right, and the vision's going to be, it was almost like the Japanese sun setting over the desert type of thing, and there's the long, windy road to get to this sun, and it was this type of corny messaging. And I remember sitting down with the guys, and they were all like very, very nice and said, "Oh yeah, that's great." And then after a few weeks, I thought to myself, "Oh, this is pretty rubbish. This, like, what on earth were you thinking?" So I changed that slightly into something a bit more. I think a bit more about the story of where we were going and, teamwork to get there. And, it was a tough first 6 months, especially was really tough. I think one of the things I had to do, I remember we had a general manager there who was one of life survivors. And lovely guy, but, he was a survivor in that business. And he was really in charge of sales. So I remember having a discussion with him after about 2 weeks of, I know that you're in charge of sales, but actually this ain't working. I know you've got this distribution, these relationships you've had for years, but a lot of them aren't working. We need to change it. And he sort of took about 2 steps back and then said, well, oh, okay. And I thought, you're not going to do anything about it. So May being May at that time, I was 32-year-old, so, still quite precocious in some ways. And I went and just organised a supplier day and a sales day. And I basically put out the messaging of the plan that I sought to all these people. And I said to them, you know what, this is where we're going to go. This is the journey we're going on. This is the company we're going to be. If you want to be part of it and you want to help us as part of that journey, great. But if you don't, there's the door at the back. And I literally was like that in the messaging. So after a few people had walked out and he'd getting really nervous, we went and rebuilt. I think sometimes you have to cut back, prune, I think, as you would say, to then rebuild. And sometimes behaviours and values and things can get lost. And sometimes that prune exercise actually can help you refocus on them. And I think that was probably what stood us in good stead. Yeah,
it almost, you get everybody pointing in the same direction.
I think one thing I haven't spoke about, which sort of happened happened a while before the States, was at 27 I got ME, chronic fatigue syndrome. That changed us in the way I thought, because I was a typical probably 20-year-old, I knew everything. I was always right, and then when I got to that, it was a case whereby I didn't even know if I was going to be out of bed on the morning, and so I went through probably, the first 6 months was just horrendous, and loads of time off work. And when you've got a young family and you're being brought up really that you were the breadwinner, old-fashioned, traditional. But when you're brought up to work, which I had been by my family, then it was a huge kick that at the time. And what was even worse was when you read the newspapers, everybody was shirkers who had it, and it wasn't a true thing anyway. And I knew how I felt, and I didn't know why I felt the way I did. And I also, deep down, I don't think I actually lost the realisation that I wasn't a shirker, but there was days when it pushed us to the brink. And I think when you go through an experience like that, I had to get to know myself, because the doctors couldn't treat us, the people didn't know what it was hardly at the time. So I had to learn my own body, what worked for me, what didn't work for me, and almost learn myself from zero. I say that now as a blessing because actually it meant I really had to do a lot of self-reflection earlier in my life than I probably would have done.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I probably would have been my age now before I probably reflected much. But no, that got us to do that at like, 27, 28-year-old. And then fortunately, I met, my mum actually, being my mum, all 4'11" and 3/4 of her. Don't forget the 3/4.
It's important.
She went and actually found this Dr. Damon at Newcastle General Hospital, who happened to be a specialist in this.
Mm-hmm.
I went there, had 2 days of tests on everything that it wasn't, and then literally turned and said, "This is what I believe it is." So at least then I had a badge for it, which helped. Mm-hmm. But that was probably 18 months down the line.
Okay.
And, I don't know what I went through mentally during that period because you didn't talk about it in them days so much.
No.
But that was a real struggle. And the other key thing that happened at that point, though, and the real sort of change around was when I went in the waiting room. The people sat in the waiting room, there's about 5 people. One of them was, trained for the Olympics. Another one was final year of an MBA, etc., etc. And I just sat there and I thought, this illness is actually for hyperachievers. It's not for shirkers. So mentally, that changed my view totally. So I wouldn't have ended up in the States. I probably would have ended up at Sire Burgess taking that risk if I hadn't been in a much better place with myself following that experience. I went to Sire about 3 years down the road from originally getting it. I would say I was probably 70% at that point. And then I went to the States, I was probably about 80%. And I probably sit here now about 90%. Still got certain limitations that affect us, but it helped me get to know myself, so give us so many different, completely different view of the world than probably most younger people have, coming through. So that was a big help.
So what are your key learnings throughout that period of time?
So one thing which I see a lot now actually, and when you get involved with mentoring and coaching business leaders, something I see a lot is there's lots of people now who want to do lots of things but never get them finished, never complete. There's lots of starters, and what I learned through that was actually if I wanted to compete with other people, so the first thing was in terms of productivity, I would say when I looked at other people, I felt that they were probably effective 30 to 40% of the time in terms of their goals. So I thought, well, straight away, if you're talking about, an 8-hour work day, then actually they're down to 3 hours, which actually was, I can do 3 good hours in a day, So that was probably one of the first learnings. The second thing would be in terms of pacing. So the pacing would be, and there's a great, I think it's in Good to Great in the book, he talks about Amundsen and Scott going to the North Pole, and I think Scott sort of said, right, and I'm going to do as many miles as we can when the weather's good, and, so he ended up tiring the dogs out and everything else, and Amundsen just said, we're going to do a 15-mile a day, no matter what the weather is, and Amundsen got there before Scott, so there's a good lesson in that,
Hair and the tortoise, isn't it?
It is the hare and the tortoise, absolutely, and I think within that was this thing of, do one thing at a time, do it well. So for me, it was in the early days, for example, within the States, it was a case of let's get the place turned around. Then let's look at what that next phase looked like in terms of real growth. And I find that people, a lot of people talk about growth too early. They haven't even got a sustainable business now. So why keep talking about growth? Let's get a sustainable business model.
We're a little bit obsessed with growth in this country, aren't we?
Yeah, and I detest, don't talk to us about scale up because I hate that word. I detest that word. And I know it's going to upset some people, but never mind.
It's in the Be More Pirate book that I talk about a lot. Sam says that this obsession with growth and getting bigger, it's like there's a medical term for that. It's cancer.
Yeah.
You can be. You see so many sort of challenger companies, who are nimble, who are able to change, who are able to reflect and stop and start, and beating the big companies nowadays. Yeah, it's interesting.
There's a friend of mine who has, he works as a global coach, and he's got a great little acronym for senior leaders, which is, all of them. all of them suffer from the Fred factors, which is F is fears, R is lack of responsibility, E is ego, and D is lack of discipline.
Yeah.
So,
I should write that one down.
just go and make your choice out of those, which ones you've got. It is a bit like that. So I think the other things I learned through the MA was, don't listen to press, don't listen even if it was local people, and, let's be honest, my ego could have got into overdrive in the States, because, yes, we had lots of people patting us on the back in what we were doing. I then came back and built up an SMA. Yes, there was a bit of profile around that, a lot of people patting us on the back again, but for me, it's just, I can't be successful unless there's other people and other infrastructure around us. I'm just, I've got me foibles, lots of foibles. I think they're getting less as I get older, but I've got lots of foibles.
But you've done that work in terms of yourself, your strengths, your weaknesses, what you're good at, you know what you need to mitigate, get other people to do. So that's
I certainly know who I don't get on well with as well, and things. So it's like, in terms of bringing in people around you, that's really important. There's a lot of businesses I go into now where I've just done a thing recently where you profile the senior team. What often you're going to find is it's actually key parts of it is a mimic of the guy who runs the company. So whether it be we've just had a senior team where everybody's very analytical, everybody. So there's no intuition on the team. It's all analytic. Now that's great if you've got really, really good process, and nothing changes. That's excellent. But as I said, so who's actually challenging in this team? Who is challenging? And there isn't anybody.
Yeah, yes.
Well, yes. So that's, I think it's interesting to get to know yourself and get to know what you work with, what you don't work with. I'll always say now, people come before strategy. If you get the right people, they'll create the right strategy.
Well, it's that saying, isn't it? Sort of culture eats strategy.
Culture eats strategy for breakfast. Yeah.
Sounds tasty.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'd rather have eggs and bacon.
But it is. It is that. I think the other thing, as I said about that occasion in that waiting room, what is it? I think was Mahatma Gandhi who did the speech around, when your thinking changes, your behaviours change, which changes your habits, which then changes your destiny. I think I paraphrased that, but that's sort of what it is, and and that's something that's really important to me. Now I live by that. The other thing I live by is go beyond your own limitations. I've got a nice leadership statement that I always align to, which, really ends up with go beyond your own leadership. Go beyond your own personal limitations. And I think that's because the MA side, that really motivated us as well. So I think that journey was all about productivity improvement in myself to compete because I wasn't on the same playing field as other people.
Well, there's so many studies that show that working 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, we're the least productive country by miles in Europe. Maybe not Europe, but in compared to a lot of other countries, because we work too much and too long, and we're just unsustainable. Yeah,
and I think one of the key problems is we don't have breaks when we should have them, and we don't have lunch, and we don't have,
It's that brilliant culture of presenteeism. You have to be sat at your desk at 9, and if you have lunch, you leave your desk for lunch. It's like your sad desk lunch, and then the first person to leave really just doesn't deserve to be here.
Yeah.
It's like, bye. Yeah. I've got a child to go and collect.
But I think it's this interesting thing when people saying, what is success? There's a question. It'll be different for everybody. For me, at one time, it was getting out of bed in the morning. That was success. I think I've come to the sort of through that question now. It's like I don't talk about success anymore. I want to make a difference. I want to be significant now. That's what I see.
Legacy stuff, isn't
it is. It's all legacy. A great book called Legacy, if you've ever read it, by James Kerr. Fabulous book. But it is all that side of it now for us. I'm over 50 as well, which I think it comes to you anyway. But I've been thinking this way for probably since about 2010, 2011. And that's what's now sort of got us involved so much with charities and social enterprises and these types of people. I was going to say there's an interesting story there because I set something up called 2020 Vision, and that was really out of spending too much time having cups of coffee for no reason with people. CCFNRs. Yep. And
Coffee for no reason.
cup of coffee for no
Yeah,
reason.
there we
See,
go. Got there.
CFNRs. She's getting there, yeah. We're there. Yeah. So
I never get them. I'm really impressed with myself today.
So yeah, with that, I did get, you know, a typical business person who lots of people want your time, so you try to be as helpful as you can. Then you end up having lots of cups of coffee where people are just wanting to take your ideas and thoughts and whatever, and really not gaining anything from it. And it wasn't so much I wanted, you know, monetary gain or whatever from it. That wasn't really the aim, but it was, I'm wasting a lot of time here. Time is the most precious commodity. So what can I do with it? And I was coming down the train from Scotland and just thought to myself, well, a lot of charity social enterprise senior leaders literally don't get the opportunity to have time to be coached by people like myself and others similar, you know, because they just can't afford it or whatever. So I thought, well, why don't I coach 5 of them each year free of charge over the next 4 years, as it was at that time, to the end of 2020. And each one of them every year needs to go off and impact another 20 people through it, which was going to aggregate, 20 children, which was going to aggregate 1,000 children. The good thing was we impacted about 2,000 in the first year. So that sort of blew that equation out the window, but I'm still doing it. We're still on doing it. So I've got another 5 this year, which makes 15 in total have gone through the alumni now of that. It's great to see the journeys they then go on and what the impact they're having. And it's also nice for me because I'm not the type generally to come on podcasts and put myself out there. I'm not that.
Pinned you down last time as well.
Yeah, I was going to say, yeah, my arm's still hurting.
That was a month ago as well, pretty much. So.
Yeah. But no, so I think it is this, you know, I'd rather lay below the surface and see other people succeed now. That's what it's about for me.
Okay, so talk us through sort of a typical week in your life, because I'm sure you're just mental. You've got that many fingers in that many pies.
Oh, here we go. Yeah.
So what do you spend your days doing now, Graham?
Meeting often. You know, we've got a number of companies in the northeast that we're building or supporting their build. So we've got an organisation which is a robotics process automation company, which is growing very nicely, turning over around about 3.7 million now. We're involved with a furniture company. That's something I'm quite excited about because it's quite different for us, you know, to get involved in. And that one now is about 1.6. It'll be an interesting end of year, I'll put it that way, for the rest of this year, because we've just done a rebrand and there's a whole relaunch around this in September with a new product range and everything else that we're quite excited about. Because up to this point, they've made money mainly through channels. So we've changed, we've aligned, we feel as though we're getting to the point where we're optimising them channels now. So we needed something different. So we'd already planned ahead. So we've got the rebrand, relaunch of their own brand coming out. So that's exciting. I'm working with a number of individuals, mentoring. I wouldn't like to think how many now. I know there's around about 11 or 12 probably ish. And we've got about another 3 companies that we're involved with as well. So it tends to be meetings across that group if I'm in the northeast. The other thing I've got going on is London. I took over heading up the Leadership Academy for Disability Rights UK. That was supposed to be a day or so a month. And literally what it's ended up in is me in a lot of civil service organisations dealing with senior leadership teams, which is very, very interesting because I've never ever dealt in the civil service. So that's got a whole different dynamic of its own. And then obviously I've still got the original business I set up in Scotland. So that just plugs along. We still work with Scottish Enterprise, who any of their supply chain issues, they generally get on the phone to us and see if I can go and help.
All of this stuff. What productivity tools, techniques, processes do you use to be able to juggle all of those plates that are spinning, if I want to mix my metaphors?
Well, I probably can't go through them all, but one, which was a classic one I got into, was around time management, so everything's coloured in my schedule. I started off with your performance cycle of preparation, doing and reflecting, or creative time as I called it. So them 3 were given different colours. So that's where I started with it many years ago. And then out of that has come different shadings of the colours for different things. So I can look at my schedule and almost go, am I spending too much time in delivering? Because that's the balance you have to strike. For me, my delivery really nowadays should be an hour or 2 with a company, with a lead. It's It's not about, I want to be there all day. And it's about making sure you get that side right. I do use a tool for coaches on managing the relationships. So it's all automated, so I don't need to send reminders for things and all this type of stuff. So, that type of thing I've come to now. Even in the modelling, team coaching models, stuff like that, I brought it right the way down to almost it's self-managed teams. And I'm almost just holding things to accountable. So that's reduced down face-to-face time. Yeah. The thing is, because I've come from a lean background, this is almost natural.
Like the waste.
I am. I just think like that in terms of models. I'm always bringing up new models like that. But that's just I'm lucky to have that probably as a natural trait now.
Yeah, it's because we work on 2 businesses, and obviously being a mum and all that sort of stuff. But it's kind of sometimes you sort of meet yourself coming backwards. Yeah, like running around like a lunatic. It's like it's got to be more to life than this. Sometimes.
Yeah, and sometimes I have to sit myself down and say, practice what you preach. Sometimes I do. We don't always get it right. Yeah, you don't always get it right. An interesting thing though for that is I did a profile until about 4 years ago, and at the time me stress management was shocking. It was terrible because when I looked at it, really I'd become a slave to day rates and other things within the original consultancy I had. So that was why we changed and went with the new business in the Northeast and things like that out the back of that. So even though I had consultants at the time, we were all just basically flogging ourselves. That had to change. So like the model we have now is nothing. There's nothing really day rate stuff. So that's a big lesson to consultants.
Is it just kind of
you can become that slave to it.
Type of thing? Yeah,
you can become that slave. Whereas but again, you have to be a bit more creative around that, as well in terms of the models. So we have things we guarantee certain things. We have some things which are success based as well. So we've got various business models that we use.
Makes more sense, doesn't it? Rather than tying it to I spent a day with you. Here's an invoice. You're aligning yourself with the direction and success of a firm.
I might as well have been working for somebody when I got to that point. And that's always the area you have to. I didn't start my business until I was around 40. Yet, when you look now, actually, that most of the successful business startups are coming from that generation in terms of like bigger businesses. And it's like the people we look to work with, most of the people we work with are probably in their 30s to 40. And why do I say that? Well, because they've got energy we don't have generally. They may even have a little bit of risk taking that we don't have in certain cases, that ambition. But you do have to look hard. I really want to say the Northeast thrive, yet we've got certain ingrained traits around the Northeast that actually stop us from thriving. I used to I remember sitting in my office in Chicago wondering, why couldn't the Northeast be like Chicago? But because Chicago's in the middle of nowhere, really. I came back the same thing. It was confidence, and now it's interesting because I get to see, people in London up against up here, quite often, generally weekly. I see that difference in attitude. Don't get us wrong, London's not everything, but what I would say is that we need to start being a bit more confident about what we've got here, and I don't mean that on over-marketing it, I mean that in action.
No, we talk about this a lot, don't we?
Yeah.
London hasn't got, the beaches and, the countryside, but they do have that, more ambition, more drive.
And it's the role models and, we do another thing in terms of the business community up here. We do tend to promote people before they've really done anything. That's what I find.
Peter principle.
Yeah, we do sort of do that. I've been surprised at certain people, and don't get us wrong, I've met some lovely people. It's not about that. It's about where they are and their profile is in relation to where the business is. And we have to be able to shout about the business success, but we have to be careful we don't shout too prematurely.
It's building people, put them on the pedestal, and then the great British pastime of then knocking them off.
Absolutely. And that's not what it should be about. And the other thing about that, in terms of knocking people off the pedestal, is always about people who do fail in business. We've all failed on certain things. Even though my first business is still running, in my eyes, that was a failure from where I saw it going originally. I would always say, but then again, my skills and everything is not really about starting a new business. My skills are coming in when you've got an existing business and making it a lot better. You know, not just from an improvement point of view, system-wise and people-wise, but now, you know, my knowledge around business models and things like that as well. I know I can make that business much more commercially sustainable and successful. I'm not the person probably for the first million. So again, about knowing where you are and what you can give, I think it's important. And literally our year growth that we set up in the Northeast is really that we're working with businesses. There is one or two, like, you know, the ones I mentioned earlier who, you know, one was 800,000, one was probably nearer 400,000 when we got introduced to them. The ambition and everything that went with that and how quickly they'd get to that point and what they already had in place, you know, and the scars. We're probably not going to get involved with, you know, university spin-outs generally because we want people in their 30s or so with scars who've made some wrong decisions as well as right, who've learned from things, you know, and I think that's really important. And I don't think we actually support them people enough.
But when I set my business, it had been a while since I'd left Northumbria University, and because I'd left a while ago, I wasn't entitled to any, you know, free support or office space or any of the sort of entrepreneurial programs that they were having. I was like, but I came here. It was like 2001, but still I did, you know.
Yeah, and I think there is a lot of... you know, not just at that age group, even older than that, you know, because I know guys who have returned to the Northeast after having really good careers elsewhere. I know guys who are in some of the larger organisations in the Northeast who actually have got ideas of their own. And it's like, okay, so how do we really tap these people as well to help them grow? And so I think we focus too much on those. You know, for me, I think, and you know, okay, I didn't go to university. I still had to go through college and do them things and night classes and the rest of it. You know, which just made my journey harder. But it was the work experience really that came with it that really set me up.
Yeah, I talk about it a lot. The two best people I recruited at Balfour Beatty were apprentices, straight out of school, right attitudes, right values, right beliefs. Trained them in the knowledge and the stuff, and they're both doing fantastically well.
You know, and
hi guys.
and you know what? Mine was an apprenticeship at the start, so I love that. It was very structured apprenticeship in them days. You know, 4 years and very structured.
Serve your time.
Serve your time. Yeah, and I think apprenticeships are great as long as the organisations are set up to really develop these kids. You know, that's what I would say with it.
Yeah, definitely.
So if we come full circle then, Graham, if we go back to the young lad with his 3 GCSEs, maths, English and electronics, could take you back to visit him, what do you think you might give as some parting advice?
I think what I should have done, I think it's two things. I think the first thing is I should have taken more risk and to earn money for myself, not for other people. Because that's an easy thing, and that's the natural way almost, and especially in them days, was to fall in and get yourself a job and you're actually making money for other people instead of doing something for yourself. Because for me, it would have been nice to have had that now, not just from your own freedom, it's not about that, but it would have been nice to have had that to give away, like I say, some other guys who I know do. You know, and I'm not that, I'm certainly not that level, you know, which would have been brilliant, you know, to make a difference to the world that way. I suppose the second thing is enjoy the ride and don't take it too seriously because stress is a killer. When I was saying earlier, like, you know, 4 years ago, my stress management was high. When I've recently done that profile, it's been okay. Under much better control. But it takes action to get there. Yeah. You know, it takes a bit of time. And I think, you know, again, we're going to be we're always looking for that silver bullet.
What's the magic thing that we can, you know, put into place?
Just put it into place and it takes all our problems away. Wouldn't that be wonderful?
Lottery win.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, thank you ever so much for your time today, Graham.
You're welcome. You're welcome. I've enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thanks. Thanks everyone for listening. Check out all the show notes at inspirationnorth.com. Join us again for the next episode when we'll be chatting to another inspirational person. If you like this, subscribe and tell your friends. If you didn't like this, subscribe anyway and tell everybody.